Seiichi Osabe is 13 years old and spending a sunny afternoon hiking in the mountains with his extended family, his grandparents, his aunt and uncle, his cousin Shigeru, and his mother, Seiko. As the family make their way up the cliff, Osabe's cousin pretends to shove him from the trail, only for Seiko to grab him, panicked as she clings to her son, the rest of the family laughing at her overprotective nature. After a little while, Osabe and Shigeru break off from the group and begin to explore a nearby forest and discover a small clearing leading out onto a vast ravine. But as they do, Osabe's mother emerges from the forest behind them, warning the boys to step back from the cliff. But Shigeru ignores her, only to lose his balance teetering over the edge of the threshold. But just before he can fall, he's saved by Osabe's mother, clutching her nephew close to her chest. And for a moment, a strange quiet falls over the clearing. As Shigeru pulls away and stares into Osabe's mother's eyes, a look of terror spreads across his face, and he utters a single frightened word. Auntie? Osabe, paralyzed in silent horror, watches his cousin's body vanish over the edge of the cliff, his terrified eyes slowly moving to his mother before she turns to him and just smiles. This is Chi no Adachi, or Trail of Blood, a story by Shuzo Oshimi and published in Big Comic Superior, and it's horrifying. This is the kind of story that creeps inside of you and whispers that the world is a more frightening place than we'd ever like to admit, as Osabe is forced to live with the knowledge of what his mother has done and in fear of what she might do next. In a story that conveys the simple human horror that can lie in the people around us. But maybe you don't like horror. Maybe what I just described sounds like a very, very bad time. And you know what? While in a way you are not wrong, you are also the person I'm making this video for. See, I think to a lot of people, horror is still seen as a cheaper or less than form of entertainment, something designed to scare and startle like a rickety amusement park ride. And hey, I recently watched a film about a haunted elevator. I love me some good popcorn horror, but the idea that that's all horror can be is what I think keeps a lot of people away from the genre. And that's a viewpoint I've really tried to fight back on with these videos. And so before we dive into A Trail of Blood, I first want to answer a little question, and that is, why horror? When you really peel it back, there are two instincts that have kept the human race going: lust and fear. Lust has kept us existing, but it's fear that's kept us alive. Without fear, we'd never have escaped our natural predators or devised the means to overcome them. Fear is an intrinsic part of being human, and all that horror is the commodification of that fear. Since humans have emerged as the undisputed champions of the food chain, our relationship with fear has changed a lot. Outside some very unusual and specific circumstances, most people will go through their lives without ever having to confront the pure terror of a natural predator. And while people not getting eaten is mostly a very good thing, it does mean that we've lost touch with an ancient and intrinsic part of who we are. And what horror does is let us reconnect to that part, letting us discover things about ourselves in a way that no other type of entertainment really can. Specifically, what I want to talk about today, however, is horror through imagery. Horror can be incredibly powerful just through a still image, and you can see this throughout history in any number of unsettling classical paintings, or even in the old medieval sea maps, which featured detailed drawings of horrific sea creatures that potentially lay in wait in the cold darkness of the ocean. My extensive research shows that these creatures did not actually exist, but the reason they were there was likely to frighten sailors in order to keep them away from more mundane dangers like unknown or turbulent waters. Possibly my favorite example of historical horror horror-based imagery, however, are the 15th and 16th century paintings of hell, and particularly from the artist Hieronymus Bosch. And I love these paintings. I mean, just imagine that you are a medieval farmer. You've spent your days toiling in the fields, tending to your livestock, never having laid eyes on anything that wasn't part of the natural world. And then just imagine the sheer mind-numbing terror you'd feel upon seeing these paintings. How much more frightening and real the existence of a horrifying afterlife would become in that moment. Horror imagery even had a massive boom in the 50s and 60s, appearing on the cover of pulp horror magazines and in the pages of Western horror comics. A movement that was unfortunately stamped out by massive public and academic backlash, something that I feel that Western horror comics have only really started to recover from in the last 2 decades. But where you can find horror imagery still alive and thriving is in the pages of Japanese manga. Like the US, 50s Japan had a massive horror comics boom driven by titles like Kitaru of the Graveyard, introducing audiences to the creatures of Japanese folklore. But without the same conservative backlash, that scene was able to grow and thrive and produce many amazing horror authors, like Kazuo Umezo, Hideshi Hino, or Suehiro Maro, all with their own distinctive brand of visual horror. And this is something I love about horror manga. I think horror is at its best when it's intense and personal, and because manga can be produced by a single person at a relatively low cost, at least compared to games or movies, it means that there's more room for weird, experimental, personal kinds of horror, letting each author carve out their own distinctive brand of fear. Take one of the all-time best, Junji Ito, for example. He's a master of distortion, taking things from the natural world and corrupting them. House cats, aquatic life, the human body, the horror of his images coming from both the prospect of being faced with these hideous, unknowable creatures, but also becoming them. The feeling of our own bodies warping and distorting and slowly turning against us, trapping us in prisons of our own flesh. That is a very specific kind of fear, but compare that to the images of Koji Matsumoto, whose illustrations capture the simple, morbid horror of encountering creatures far larger and more dangerous than you are, creating these nightmarish images where humanity is no longer the apex predator, but small, weak, and frightened. Both these artists are incredible at creating strong visual horror, but the kind of horror those images convey is totally different. And so, with that in mind, I want to now ask the question, what is the horror of Trail of Blood? And the answer to that is the simple, intimate horror of human emotion. A lot of Oshimi's stories focus on emotionally vulnerable people trapped in awful situations that slowly push them towards breaking point. Like Inside Mari, a body swap story about a young college dropout who awakens one morning to find himself in the body of a high school girl. But where this scenario is usually used for romantic hijinks, Inside Mari is a disturbing look at identity, obsession, and the feeling of losing yourself in another person. And this is a common theme with Oshimi. He writes about characters going through disturbing, frightening changes, whether it's direct allegories for puberty like his vampire manga Happiness, or more subtle series like Aku no Hana, Flowers of Evil, the story of a teenage love triangle that gradually spirals its characters into darker, more violent versions of themselves. I had to cut out a big paragraph about Flowers of Evil because it didn't flow with the rest of the video, but it's really good and you should read it and not watch it, and okay. And what makes these stories so disturbing is how Oshimi is able to take these intimate, frightening moments in people's lives and trap the reader in them, making us feel everything these characters would feel. And to show you what I mean here, I want you to imagine that you are a small child walking in the park with your mother, but your little legs can't keep up with her, and she shouts at you to hurry it up. And as she drifts further and further away and begins to disappear over the horizon, you call out to her, only for her to stop and look at you like this. Fear fear is gonna hit everyone differently, but when I read this panel, it filled me with what I can only describe as sheer pants-shitting terror. And what makes this scene so frightening is how Oshimi visually traps us in this moment. The entire scene unfolding from first person, forcing us to embody this small child, meaning that this first page carries the uncomfortable sinking feeling of losing your parents at a supermarket. But then when we turn the page and reveal this furious face contorted in hate, this woman isn't staring at a character in the story, she's staring at us. And it's frightening, but it's this kind of subtle visual horror that makes Oshimi's work so disturbing. There's this unsettling duality to a lot of Oshimi's illustrations. He's an incredible painter, able to create works of real breathtaking beauty. But it's like there's always this other side to his paintings. Always some little visual aspect that feels strange and wrong. A young girl gazing down at the viewer, her cheek speckled with dried blood. A woman staring at you, whispering something to a child against a flesh-colored background. A young face covered in shadow melting into the distorted darkness that surrounds it. And a lot of it's so subtle, I could see people not finding these images frightening, but to me, what's creepy is a lot of them feel normal until you just stare at them for a while. And slowly, something unseemly begins to creep to the surface. It's these images that are the building blocks to Oshimi's stories. Whether he's drawing a small town at sunset, the exterior of a family home, or just a figure standing in a doorway, he knows how to create panels that quietly whisper to you that something here is very wrong. But it's more than just these images being spooky by themselves, as it's through these panels the trail of blood builds its tension. Most scares in horror come in two parts: the gradual build of tension, say like a character wandering through a spooky house, and the release of that tension with an actual fright, the reveal of something supernatural or a serial killer or whatever. These cycles of tension and fright are the basic building blocks of horror, and how a piece of media handles them is going to define a lot about the kind of fear it creates. And this is where Trail of Blood's distinct emotional brand of fear really shines. When Trail of Blood first released, it was advertised as a new series full of chilling silence. And what they meant by this is that so much of Trail of Blood is taken up by quiet, empty space. Pages passing without anything really happening. But because Oshimi's panels are so good at conveying this uncomfortable, uncanny feeling, when he combines them into pages, it creates this creeping atmosphere of dread, focusing on the tiny details of a scene, but in doing so, grinding the pace of the story to a crawl and forcing us to experience every little sensation and emotion, each tiny jolt of panic and every little twinge of fear, which is why some of the most disturbing moments of Trail of Blood can be as subtle as a hand clasping over a shoulder, a startled, terrified glance, or an eye peering through an open doorway. It's not uncommon for multiple pages to pass without a word of dialogue or anything significant even happening, and it can be agonizing, but it's that tension that traps you in these scenarios, forcing you to feel everything that these characters feel. But what's so uniquely frightening about Trail of Blood is how it pays off that tension with the frights themselves. Frights that often consist of nothing more than the subtle, intimate horror of the human face. Like a lot of things with Trail of Blood, that might not sound terrifying straight away, but think of it like this. A person's face is the most expressive part of them. Studies have identified 7 core facial expressions that occur naturally from birth across all races and cultures, meaning we are biologically hardwired to express ourselves through our faces. The minute folds of our skin and subtle movements of our muscles indicating not only how we feel, but who we are, and whether we should be treated with trust, caution, or fear. That's why it's so important for artists to have a solid understanding of the language of the human face and how to use it, as in the right hands it can become a really powerful storytelling tool, conveying fictional creations as people who feel and think, letting us empathize with them on a primal emotional level. This is something that Oshimi is really incredible at. He's insanely skilled at drawing the human face and able to capture all these subtle flashes of emotion that can feel so genuine and chilling. He's able to give characters the glow of someone who's just fallen in love for the first time, but also the paralyzing terror of someone who's just witnessed something unspeakable. Even just little obscured glimpses of his character's facial features are so adept at communicating their state of mind that it's difficult not to empathize with them, not to feel their fear, their sorrow, and their rage. And where this becomes a tool for horror is when it's used as a window into who these people are, revealing things that are awful and frightening. For example, after witnessing what happened on the cliff, Osabe is racked not only with horror at what his mother has done, but guilt, having lied to protect her. But there's also this small issue that Osabe's cousin actually survived. Brain damaged and comatose, but alive. But as he begins to recover, the truth starts to seep out. Osabe's aunt slowly piecing together what really happened. And so when one day she appears in front of Osabe's school offering him a lift home, it's already kind of horrifying, the two riding in silence against a creeping sense of dread until finally she casually confronts Osabe about what really happened. And when Osabe lies again, she looks at him like this. This is the face of a woman who's just realized her sister-in-law tried to kill her son and that her nephew is lying to her about it, and it's horrifying. This is how Trail of Blood scares you. It creates these disturbing, frightening scenarios, building the tension of these scenarios through its panels, and then crescendoing that tension with these horrifying revelations about its characters, conveyed purely through their facial expressions. And it's this cycle of horror that makes Trail of Blood so unique and uncomfortable. And there's one more instance of this I want to talk about, but this time one that touches on the core horror of Trail of Blood. It starts with Osabe returning home from school, but as he does, he hears angry shouting coming from the back of his home. And when he draws closer, he finds his parents arguing, his father furious as to why Seiko hasn't visited her nephew in the hospital, and storms away. Seiko falls to her knees, silence, but after a moment, she begins murmuring, whispering something about wanting it all to disappear, but then begins speaking in a strange voice as if to a child, waving her hands in the empty air as if stroking someone and holding them, telling them to put on their shoes and that it's time to go. Seichi realizing with horror that she's speaking to a delusional version of him as a child, and as he peers into her eyes, he sees this. This is the face of a woman lost in a blissful, frightening delusion, one whose grasp on reality has slipped and they have now fallen into a deep, violent madness. And now there's no telling what they might do to her family, to her husband, to even her own son. And it's all there, plain to read on her face. There's no pleasant way to put this, but Trail of Blood is a story about a mother slowly going insane and potentially hurting her own child. And that's a subject so taboo that precious few pieces of horror ever even go near it, and reasonably so. Parents harming their children is a deeply upsetting and unnatural concept. And if you're sensitive to material like that, I'd think very carefully about whether this is a story you want to experience. as the reason I spend so much of this video talking about how the horror is conveyed visually is because of how intimate and frightening it makes it feel, and particularly around Seiko. Osabe's mother is terrifying, easily one of the most frightening characters I've ever experienced in horror, and so much of that is how she's presented to us like a mother. Early chapters are littered with panels and scenes where we view her from first person, as she watches us from the edge of a classroom, looks down on us as we hold her hand, or as she peers deep into our eyes, filling the page and making it feel like her face is just inches away from our own. And it's from that intimate perspective we're given the quiet, horrifying breakdown of this woman. Someone who for years has endured a life she never wanted, each passing day pushing her closer towards her breaking point, slowly cracking her open and letting something evil and horrifying creep in. This is why I think the moment on the cliff is so horrifying. It's a moment where for a second Osabe, this young kid, sees what his mother really is. He sees that the person who has loved and protected him his entire life is also something terrifying and hateful. And there's a real pure horror in that moment, but there's also something kind of human there too. Most people spend their childhood idolizing their parents, seeing them as these infinite heroic protectors who will set everything right. But as we get older, we realize that they are not that they are just people. People who are as flawed and fallible and capable of evil as anyone else. And that's a pretty frightening realization for most people. And all Trail of Blood does is it takes that feeling and drags it into a searing, horrifying light. And in doing so, exposing it, confronting us with the uncomfortable truth that the people we love are just people, and that in them lies the capacity for great evil. And that's why I love horror. It can be silly and fun and cathartic, but it can also let us engage with the darkest parts of being human, and in doing so, help us understand them. That's why it bothers me when I feel like there's still misconceptions about horror. If you look at the list of the most profitable films of all time, horror or things that are horror adjacent take up nearly half the list. And yet, in the near 100-year-long history of the Oscars, only 6 horror movies have ever been nominated for Best Picture. And sure, who cares about the Oscars? But I do think that disparity shows that to a lot of people, horror is still considered cheap or less than. But to me, the opposite's true. Horror can be anything. By distorting reality and breaking taboos, it lets us experience existence at its most frightening, and in doing so, breaking us open and revealing truths like nothing else can. And that's what I think A Trail of Blood does. Friends, thank you for joining me today. I hope you had a good time with this video, and if you did and maybe want to help me create more like it, you can do so over at patreon.com/super Eyepatch Wolf, where for a single $1 you can have your name listed here, as well as the chance to have your name read out like these fine folks: Orc Fighter, Rhino Z, Chelfie, Eric VG, Grizzly Hair, Brittany Elston, and Shadow Badger. As ever, find me on the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast or on Twitter @EyepatchWolf. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.